China's second most powerful leader has arrived in Australia. Wine exports and cute pandas will be the focus in Adelaide today. Tomorrow here in Canberra, it's down to the more difficult issues. And this morning, Foreign Minister Penny Wong joins us to discuss navigating this challenging relationship. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. Li Qiang is the first Chinese premier to visit Australia in 7 years. The goodwill visit is another sign of China's shift from wolf warrior to panda diplomacy. Both sides want trade to flourish, but Australia's concerns about China's military provocations in the region are growing. We'll come to that with Penny Wong. Domestically, the week saw the contest between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton sharpen over climate change. Both leaders think they're on a winner and are throwing everything at this. The opposition leader says the push to renewables is driving up power prices. The Prime Minister says hitting the brakes would be even worse. The teals, meanwhile, are rubbing their hands together at the prospect of another climate campaign.
Peter Dutton has reignited the political fight over climate change.
I'm not going to sign up to a Prime Minister's policy that is really going to further harm Australian families.
Peter Dutton is walking away from climate action, walking away from the Paris Accord.
We're going to meet our net zero by 2050 target. That's absolutely essential and we're committed to that.
We've always said that when we signed up to it, that we wanted to make sure that we had a uniquely Australian way of achieving it while not tearing up the economy.
I think we should call that for what it is, which is a complete furphy. We cannot hit net zero by 2050 if we don't have interim targets along the way.
We're committed to net zero by 2050. And in terms of the targets otherwise, we'll make those decisions when we're in government.
Why won't the coalition release its revised target before the election?
Well, first of all, we need to see the modelling. It's honest and sensible to say we will wait until we are in a position to actually evaluate what is the effect on Australia.
Did this go through party room?
Well, I don't think that this is a massive change in policy here.
Did you take that decision to Cabinet? Sorry, Shadow Cabinet? Well, as you know, I mean, we opposed in the Parliament this measure. So yes, it's gone through Shadow Cabinet.
Peter Dutton is continuing to pit climate action against the economy.
Out of all of the Prime Minister's remarks over the last couple of days, he's never mentioned electricity prices. He's never mentioned the cost of living crisis.
No action until 2040 means energy shortfalls. It means higher costs.
The government can work out the numbers and go to international conferences, and yes, they're important, but I'm not hearing anything from them that brings the focus back to Australian families and businesses.
That's bad for our economy, bad for jobs, bad for future generations and bad for our climate. So this is just bad politics pursuing bad policy.
Some of the teals, Monique Ryan, Sophie Scompson, they will vote with Labor because they're Greens, they're not teals.
People don't want to see the climate wars again. People want to move on.
Do you think that Australians really want a seventh election fought on climate change?
No, I don't think they do. Thanks very much.
My guest this morning is Foreign Minister Penny Wong. First, let's check what's making news. Plenty of flags, hats and scarves were rolled out to give the Chinese Premier a warm welcome on a chilly Adelaide afternoon. Li Qiang issued a brief statement after touching down, saying shelving differences had helped get the relationship back on track after a period of twists and turns. We'll see if Penny Wong agrees differences have indeed been shelved. The 9 newspapers report Australian members of a radical Islamist organisation have been using front groups to infiltrate the mainstream pro-Palestinian movement. It says an operation's been uncovered involving members of Hizb ut-Tahrir using the new Stand for Palestine campaign to reinvigorate its efforts to destroy Israel and create an Islamic caliphate. And finally, 2 stories on the renewables rollout. The Sunday Tasmanian reports residents in the proposed Northwest Renewable Energy Zone say they're mortified large wind turbines could be built in their backyards. While in New South Wales, the Sun Herald reports opponents of an Illawarra offshore wind zone have vowed to maintain their fight after Energy Minister Chris Bowen yesterday announced it would go ahead. The project's been scaled down in size and pushed to 20 kilometres offshore rather than 10. Well, these examples of community backlash highlight the challenge facing the rollout of renewables. This great energy transition is progressing, but it is proving slower and more costly than earlier thought. Still, does the risk the 2030 target won't be met mean it should be abandoned altogether? Well, polls show voters are more worried right now about cost of living than emissions. Peter Dutton is certainly tapping into those concerns. But as ageing coal plants continue to close, he's yet to spell out a cheaper alternative to replace them over the next decade or so. Let's see what the panel makes of it, and we're joined this week by Jennifer Hewitt, Paul Sakal and Anna Henderson. Very good morning to all of you. Let's start on what happened in the climate debate this week. Jennifer, perhaps just to explain what happened, because it did take some, even shadow ministers, by surprise. How did Peter Dutton arrive at this position of saying we're not only opposed to the 2030 target, but we'll go to the election without an alternative?
Well, there are a few things going on, of course, here. One is that he wants to use the nuclear policy, the coalition's nuclear policy, as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card on climate change, saying, look, we're certainly very committed to this, net zero by 2050, that's fine. But what he's really also trying to do is, one, say that the government's targets are unrealistic, but more importantly say the fact that they're really driving hard towards this is because that's why your power bills are going up. And rather than renewable energy being cheaper, this is costing all of you, and it's also, and I think he says, this is the kind of great economic story of our times, the cost of energy, it's costing households, it's costing businesses, and that's the kind of line that he's pushing, because he's aware, as of course the government is, that all of the polls show and people instinctively know that cost of living is the key issue now. Yeah,
and I've got a poll I'll show in a minute, but look, I just want to show you the moment, because it was kind of almost a throwaway comment midway through a press conference when he made this. He said that they won't work out their 2030 target until after the next election.
In terms of the targets otherwise, we'll make those decisions when we're in government.
We'll make those decisions when we're in government. Look, it's not what he was saying just a couple of weeks after the last election 2 years ago, when he said they would have a target before the election.
In terms of our own target, we'll announce that before the next election.
So there's been a shift here. Obviously, cost of living concerns have grown, Paul, but how did that go down this week? Peter Dutton actually saying what he said.
It was mixed, and I think, as the clips show, a lot of this has been done on the fly. It wasn't planned. He didn't want to have this debate last week. So he did this interview with the Oz on the Saturday. It was a freewheeling interview. He spoke about all manner of topics. The reporters picked out that one quote, did a news story on it. There was a sense in the coalition during the weekend that it was blown up. He didn't actually mean to say they would pull out of Paris. So Saturday, Sunday, Ted O'Brien, Dutton, other shadow ministers, was a flurry of calls, a lot of calls into teal seats where people were quite concerned, candidates were concerned. On Monday, there was this correction story in the Oz.
We're still in Paris.
We're still in Paris. But Dutton's view was, and the people he spoke to over the weekend, his view was, look, we didn't kind of mean to blow this up, but let's lean into it. Let's rip the Band-Aid off. This is where we're going with it. So let's have the debate, because it allows Dutton to kind of add to the framing that he's doing on climate.
And was the decision, though, to go as far as saying we won't have a 2030 target until the other side of the election?
That was his decision. He didn't want to create kind of speculation as to where they were going to land on a target. He wants to be able to very clearly say, your grocery bills are going up because of Labor's ideological fantasy. He's made this bet. Personally, he has a firm view that people are not as into climate change, as into that issue as they were in 2022. There's a poll in Kooyong, Liberal poll, which shows it was the top issue at the last election. It's now the third or fourth issue.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Yeah, a seat like Kooyong, that's interesting. Well, I'll show you this. This is from JWS research. Look, it's just one of a number of polls that show this. But since the last election, a whole bunch of issues there, how they've tracked at the top, cost of living. You can see the red line. It's gone up and up and up. And since the election, in the middle there, health hasn't moved much. Housing's climbed. Down the bottom, the green line, climate change, you can see it has tapered off as those cost of living concerns have bitten, Anna.
Yeah, the sales job just got a lot harder for the government on this front, and the coalition is obviously seeing that they can use this, and even though it was perhaps some clever questioning in terms of trying to lock down positions which led us here, eventually it seems like the opposition was going to get here. And also I feel like the way that the opposition is creating policy at the moment gives them a lot of get out of jail free clauses because everything is sort of movable and fluid. There's never a press release or a document to say this is our policy. So there's a lot of movement that can still be made before the next election, but handily it still grabs the headlines, and there's so few policies out there from the coalition. It means that things like this get a lot of airtime.
Yeah.
And people don't want to be pinned down on the details, really. They're not, most people don't understand it. And so he's just trying to avoid the coalition having, a fight over exactly what the target will be, because most people don't understand it. They just kind of want the big picture stuff. And if he can convince them, enough people, he won't convince obviously everybody, including in teal seats, that the government, that the coalition's still committed to net zero, but doesn't. It's more the kind of the general impression he's trying to leave.
And just on this, in terms of most people not really understanding the 2030 target, people who did focus groups this week, this issue wasn't coming up. People aren't really registering the technical detail of these arguments. They're seeing top line stuff.
We can talk technical detail though. The Paris Agreement because there's been debate about this, can you water down or abandon a target under the Paris Agreement and still stay in? Is that?
Well, you don't have to water it down. I mean, that's the point. Most countries are not going to meet their Paris Agreement either. You just kind of conveniently ignore it, say you're making your best efforts. I mean, so I think a lot of this kind of detail, again, won't be that relevant as long as they keep saying, oh, we still believe in the Paris Agreement, we're not going to withdraw.
Technically, I don't think any country has ratcheted down their target.
No,
the idea is you
but
ratchet
supposed
it up.
to keep
But
going.
you're right, if you miss it, does it, what is there a penalty?
Yes.
Well, arguably there might be some border tariffs from Europe or elsewhere.
Yeah, but that's something that they're going to be worried about, beyond the next election, not any time.
Tony Wood, from the Grattan Institute, was saying this week that what Dutton could theoretically do is leave the 2030 target in place, keep the Climate Change Act in place, don't actually repeal it, go at his own pace. He's not going to meet it. Labor may not have met it anyway. And then when he does a 2035 target, which is what he'll have to do if he does get into government, which is unlikely, he could just put the 2035 target where the 2031 was, because that's not
40-ish%.
Yeah, that's not a backslide.
And the 2035 target needs to be set when? This is a little vague as well. February seems to be...
Suggestion by February after advice from the Climate Change Authority later
could be pushed out later in next year
like
beyond the Australian election.
I think it's just regular practice to do it in the first quarter of the year, but it's not absolutely necessary, and I think that's why the Prime Minister's been hesitating on being too definitive on this.
Well, I understand he may not have a 2035 target before the election. He doesn't feel under pressure now from Peter Dutton on this. So,
well, they've already tested that it's not like the public's necessarily focused on the figure, haven't they? So the opposition's allowed that to be sort of front run. But what about the investment opportunity aspect of this? Like the hard reality is, if you have this confusion and the companies that are putting the money into different types of energy, like what happens for them in this period?
And that's why certainly the big business community is rather alarmed at this.
Because what happens,
here we go again.
If you hit the brakes now, right, on the renewable rollout, the transmission lines, as difficult as it's proving to be, does that help with prices or make things worse?
Well, I think it's just going to, create more problems about the level of investment that is going ahead, and more confusion, and it's certainly not going to improve prices. I mean, Dutton is going on the basis that there'll be a lot more gas.
From where?
Exactly, that is a big problem given the attitude of people towards gas, and particularly the state governments in New South Wales and
stringing
Victoria.
out coal. Look, we're seeing that happen for like a couple of years, but can you string out coal plants that are getting pretty old for 10 or 15 years or more?
Well, that's why I think you're seeing the business community sound the alarm about why this is not a really good idea, and at least you should at least have policy certainty that you're heading towards that. But of course, Dutton's audience is really not the big business community. His audience is more the small business community.
Well, the other aspect of all of this that can often get overlooked is the impact on the climate. Now, yes, it's a global challenge. What Australia does also it needs to be looked at with what the rest of the world is doing. But look, I did have a look at this for our Insiders on Background podcast this week with Dr. Joelle Gurgis. She's a renowned climate scientist, was one of the lead authors on the IPCC's most recent report, and she is certainly worried about delaying action for the next decade or so.
If you think about something like the Black Summer bushfires in 2019, 2020, they were absolutely devastating when it comes to the impacts it had on society and the environment. But conditions like that become average by the 2040s and becomes really cold conditions, or a cooler summer in the 2060s. And so when you think about what that means for our future, I mean, it's horrific to actually to stop and to contemplate what that looks like.
You can listen to that full podcast, use the QR codes there to get into the science of what we're talking about here. But it is interesting to reflect on what the impact would be on Australia if not enough is done over the coming 5 or 10 years. And it's interesting that the Prime Minister, I want to show you this, in response to all of this, he's also focusing on the climate impacts in Australia. I mean, he's been listing things like the Black Summer bushfires, some of the other natural disasters that we've seen just in the last couple of years.
This is about our economy. It's about our jobs, but it's also about our environment. Since I've been Prime Minister, I have attended natural disasters in New South Wales, Tasmania, the Kimberley, the Adelaide Riverland, northern Tasmania, the Gold Coast hinterland, far north Queensland.
This is this old debate, isn't it?
He hasn't got a black summer to campaign on this time, and the community isn't energised in the same way with the kind of consistent months of headlines around what can happen to the climate.
It's fascinating how sentiment changes
in
Australia based on whether we've just gone through one of these terrible natural disasters.
Yeah, it's always very jarring when we have these political debates about climate and then you hear a scientist make a comment as stark as the one that was made to you in that podcast. I mean, Albanese might have a summer of bushfires. I don't know what the forecast is for this year, but there might be some floods.
No one's going to wish that.
No one's going to wish that, of course. And then, I mean, Labor's hope is that if they go to an election next year, the economic situation might be looking a bit rosier. They aren't planning to go this year, although it's not ruled out. And perhaps you go into an election in May, perhaps we've had a summer of bushfires and Dutton being portrayed as backward with no vision for the future on climate, that might be more potent.
Just quickly on the teal seats too, obviously the teals, this helps them, they know that. They were everywhere this week talking about it, but I just want to touch on one of them who's lost or is going to lose her seat. The draft boundary redistribution from the Electoral Commission came out Friday and Kylie Tink's seat of North Sydney goes. Look, there's been a bit of speculation, would she run in Bradfield, Paul Fletcher's seat, because part of her seat goes in there. I understand that's most unlikely.
We've already got a candidate who's there and
Nicolette Buller, who's Climate 200 backed independent, did pretty well last time, will run again. But those changes in New South Wales also affect a whole bunch of other seats. Do they favour one side or the other, or is that clear?
I feel like it's complicated.
I think it's very, very complicated, and some I think are a little bit harder for the Liberals, some are a little bit harder for Labor. I think it's pretty difficult.
Paul Fletcher's in trouble, though.
Yeah, Paul Fletcher, for example, is definitely in trouble.
Paul Fletcher's in trouble. Jerome Laxale and Bennelong has a much tougher job. On the whole, in WA, Victoria, New South Wales, Liberal officials hoped they would pick up more seats in a net sense across the whole redistribution. It hasn't been as favourable for them as they thought, although overall the margin that the coalition now needs to get back into government is a little bit smaller, like this overall swing that they require.
So Angus Taylor loses Goulburn as well, which has been a real stronghold for him.
Yeah, takes in the Snowies now.
Yes, there's a change there, and there's a change I think for Eden Monero as well. But I feel like with the climate debate and overlaying on these seats and the redistribution, still the key thing is that Peter Dutton had that killer line this week, I'm here for you, not the people in Paris, which on its face kind of seemed really kind of like as if he didn't understand, or as if people wouldn't understand it wasn't about the people of Paris. But the point he's making is that a decision made in Paris, which was really important about the future of kind of global climate politics, he's maybe managed to distill down to some question of, people eating a baguette under the Eiffel Tower rather than you trying to do your bills.
All right, let's move on. Time to talk to Foreign Minister Penny Wong. She will be joining the Chinese Premier for lunch at an Adelaide winery today, along with Trade Minister Don Farrell. The trade relationship has dramatically improved, but challenges remain on a range of other fronts. Australian citizen Yang Hengjun has been given a suspended death sentence in China. Last month, a Chinese fighter jet dropped flares near an Australian Navy helicopter. And then there's the most difficult issue, Taiwan. Premier Li Qiang has adopted tougher language than his predecessors on China's desire for reunification. And Australia's ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, argues China's military posture has changed. He gave a speech on Taiwan last week in what he says was his capacity as a China scholar rather than ambassador.
Xi Jinping's accumulating military capacity and his political intentionality to take Taiwan by force, if he judges he can, is therefore relatively clear.
Penny Wong, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
I'll come to Taiwan in a moment, but first, how would you characterise the relationship with China at the moment? Premier Li said in a statement last night, differences have been shelved. That's not exactly Australia's view, is it?
Well, first I want to say this is obviously a really important visit. It's the first visit in 7 years by the Chinese Premier, and it comes after 2 years of very deliberate, very patient work by this government to bring about a stabilisation of the relationship and to work towards the removal of trade impediments. I said before the election, we wanted to stabilise the relationship. What that meant was a recognition that there will be differences that have to be managed in the relationship. We are better if we engage to deal with those differences. The phrase you used, I think, David, was to navigate that relationship. So you've heard us say, we will cooperate where we can, we will disagree where we must, and we will engage in our national interest.
Let's look at some of those differences you're having to manage. The Pacific, we know China's efforts to increase influence and presence in the Pacific is a concern. You're constantly trying to counter that. In fact, you're off to PNG with 6 other ministers as soon as Premier Lee's gone. That sounds like a pretty big delegation. How concerned are you about what China's doing in PNG and the Pacific?
That is a very substantial and serious ministerial delegation to Papua New Guinea, and it's because this government understands the importance to Australia of engagement in the Pacific. We understand that it matters to Australia's stability, security, prosperity in the region, and because we want to be and are being more involved members of the Pacific family. The reality is Mr Dutton and the coalition abandoned the field in the Pacific, and others have filled that space. We are now in a position where Australia is a partner of choice, but the opportunity to be the only partner of choice has been lost by Mr Dutton and his colleagues, and we're in a state of permanent contest in the Pacific. That's the reality. I wish there were a rewind button. We could, recover the last 10 years, but we don't. We have to deal with what we have now, which is a permanent contest in the Pacific.
Okay, but in fairness, it's not all Peter Dutton's fault. This has a bit to do with China and what it's doing in the Pacific, right? Now, we know climate change...
Well, hang on. Can I just stop you there? But it is incumbent upon governments to ensure they place Australia in the best position possible. And the reality is Mr Dutton and his colleagues did not do that over 10 years, and so we are where we are.
And what about...
Which is a permanent contest.
Which brings us to climate change, because I wanted to get your thoughts on the debate we're having in Australia right now and will have now to the election and how that's going to play in the Pacific.
Yes, I was listening with interest to your panel's discussion, and I'd make a few observations. The first is this. Mr Dutton's walking away from climate action again is a recipe for higher energy bills in Australia, and I'll come back to that. It is also him yet again abandoning the field in the Pacific. I still get, when I move around the Pacific, people remembering him joking about climate change by talking about water lapping at the door of Pacific nations. People still remember that. That is, apart from being not a very decent thing to say, it is also a diminution of Australia's influence. It affects Australia's influence in the region. So he's walking away from it at home. He's also abandoning the field in the Pacific. But can I come back to the cost issue? Because that was obviously a discussion on the panel.
You are a former minister, so I'll let you go just briefly.
It's just, it is mind-bogglingly absurd for him to suggest that more uncertainty will do anything other than increase costs. His policy is a policy that will lead to higher electricity bills for Australians. Higher electricity bills for Australians. During their tenure of government, where they had in excess of 20 policies, what did that uncertainty mean? Remember, 24 coal stations announced closures. 24 coal stations announced closure. So you have a situation where, as Jennifer said, that the market looks at this and says, well, there's a lot of uncertainty, so we're not going to invest. Meanwhile, the old technology is exiting the market. You're reducing supply. What does that mean? Higher electricity prices.
Okay, but on the strategic implications of this climate debate, are you saying it would cost Australia strategically in the Pacific if we were to water down those targets?
Yeah. Peter Dutton abandoning climate change means higher prices at home, and it means he yet again abandons the field in the Pacific. That's what it means.
Does the government need to therefore step up to, when it comes to a 2035 target before the election?
Look, I am upfront with Pacific neighbours about our Pacific family, the Pacific family about this. What I say is, look, we have a big policy task. We have a big task in our economy to meet the 2030 target. Of course, there are many people who would like higher targets, would like more action, but I am upfront about this is, after 10 years of inaction, we have a lot of work to do and we are doing it.
So you might not have a 2035 target before the election?
Well, that's a matter for...
All right.
Well, yeah, we've got a 2030 target and we're working pretty hard to achieve that.
Okay.
And we also need to, as you know, again, confront a coalition which is stuck in the past, but also stuck in an absurd place where they're not actually dealing with the reality of prices.
Let's come back to the issues on the table over the next few days with the Chinese Premier. On Taiwan, Kevin Rudd said it would be foolish to ignore the increasing clarity of China's military signalling. He says Xi Jinping's intention to take Taiwan by force, if he can, is relatively clear. Do you agree?
I would say on Taiwan, and this is obviously one of the riskiest flashpoints in the world, I would say on Taiwan, our position, it's a long-standing bipartisan Australian position, which we advocate very clearly, is that we support the maintenance of the status quo, that the status quo is the best path for us to maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific and in the world. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo. In terms of the military activities in and around the Taiwan Strait, you have heard me and others speak very clearly about this. We are deeply concerned about the increased activities and the risk of miscalculation, the risk of mistake, and that is a view we have put publicly and we have put directly to China.
And you will put directly to Premier Lee as well?
Consistently with what we have done, we will deal with those issues and many other issues where we do have to navigate a set of differences of views between how China operates in this region and how the sort of region Australia and many others want to engage in.
Earlier this year you said you were appalled at the suspended death sentence handed to Australian citizen Yang Hengjun in China. You said you would not relent in advocating for justice for Dr Yang and appropriate medical treatment. Can you give us an update? Are you aware, has he been given appropriate medical treatment at least?
Look, that is our... look, first, I'm obviously constrained for privacy reasons about what I'm going to say on a television interview. What I would say to you is what I said then is still my position and still the government's position. We will continue to advocate for Dr Yang at wherever we are able, and we will continue to advocate, including for appropriate medical treatment.
Is his life at risk? Are you able to...
Look, yeah, we will continue to advocate for appropriate medical treatment. I'm not going to go through someone's medical treatment on national television.
What about China's support for Russia during its war in Ukraine? G7 leaders yesterday issued a statement on this. They're calling on China to cease the transfer of weapons, components and other equipment to Russia. They've threatened further financial sanctions. Do you support this sort of tougher stance from the G7?
I think I said on your program some time ago that just after, or in the period after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is I said, the world does look to China, which has a special responsibility as a great power and as a permanent member of the Security Council to use its influence to end this war. We have expressed concerns similar to those expressed by the G7 about potential activities of Chinese firms. Will continue to express to China our views about the importance of the war ending and Ukraine being able to secure peace on its own terms.
On a brighter note, Minister, will Adelaide Zoo be getting some new pandas?
Well, my family, like many other South Australian families, have enjoyed the pandas over many years. I went to drop my daughter off at school and the class had done a panda conservation, a panda habitat project that was on the wall, and the pandas have been a great part of the lives of many Adelaide families, and so we look forward to that continuing. Obviously, I can't make announcements ahead of time, but I can say to you, I'll be heading off to the zoo this morning.
You'll be there in a couple of hours. We'll
I will.
stay tuned for that. Look, we know on the trade front things have improved a great deal, and we know Premier Lee will also go to Perth and look at some critical minerals there as well. Just wondering if you can clear up for us, does Australia want China's investment in critical minerals or not?
Well, the right question is, what do we want for our critical minerals industry? We want to grow our critical minerals industry.
The question I asked was about China's investment.
I'll come to that. I'll come to that. And we want more jobs, more downstream processing, and we have put in through the budget, through the Future Made in Australia policy framework, more incentives to ensure we have more critical minerals industry here. Your question goes to foreign investment. What is our position on foreign investment? One, we welcome foreign investment that is in accordance with the national interest. We have a clearer foreign investment framework that the Treasurer Jim Chalmers has announced that looks to both transparency and predictability, but also how we ensure national security, and is clear about which sectors we would take particular interest in as we consider foreign investment applications. Critical minerals is one of the. Critical minerals is one of those sectors, David. I'm actually saying something important there.
No, it is. Well, just to be clear on that, the whole Future Made in Australia idea seems to be here to have more critical minerals processing in Australia because China's got too much of a monopoly on it. Is that right?
Well, the critical minerals strategy reflects the importance of securing supply chains for those things which matter, particularly as we move to renewable energy. I mean, this is a critical capability for us as a renewable energy superpower. These are inputs into renewable energy transmission and generation which matter. So of course we want to make sure we can do more here. That's what the policy is about.
I'm just still a little unclear. Can Chinese companies take advantage of processing critical minerals in Australia under your policy?
Well, that is dealt with by the Foreign Investment Framework, which is what I was trying to say before, that we have a foreign investment framework. It is open to all to apply to that. There is more predictability and transparency as a result of Jim Chalmers' reforms. We have also said there will be areas where we'll pay particular attention to national interest considerations. Critical minerals is one of them.
Let me turn to the war in Gaza, Minister. Last week, Israeli Special Forces rescued 4 hostages that were being held there, but they inflicted heavy civilian casualties. Estimates vary. We know Israel says less than 100 people were killed. Gaza's health ministry says it was more than 270 civilians who were killed. Either way, a very heavy death toll. Was it worth it?
Oh, David, we mourn every life that is lost in this conflict. We mourn every Israeli life and every Palestinian life. And this conflict has been horrific. And the loss of life, what occurred on October 7th, what has occurred since, the loss of life, that people are starving, the civilian casualties, all of this is horrific. I think what we have to do, and what I have been seeking to do, is to add our voice to the call for ceasefire, the release of hostages, the humanitarian aid to be provided. We have an opportunity now as an international community with the resolution in the UN Security Council that was backed across the world. We have to keep pressing for that.
But on this operation in particular, Benjamin Netanyahu says it was heroic. Europe's foreign policy chief has called it a bloodbath. It goes to whether it's proportionate or not. What do you think?
What I think is all of this has been horrific. And what we need to focus on now is a ceasefire, and that's what I'm doing.
Look, you've insisted Australia's not selling weapons to Israel. The International Arms Trade Treaty does include references as well to parts and components. It says they should not be sold if there's knowledge of crimes against humanity or civilians being targeted. Australia does sell parts, of course, to the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter that's used by Israel. Is Australia being consistent with that treaty?
We have to be consistent with that treaty, and we are, and we will be. But can I start back at your point to me about what I've said and what others have said? I do think that the Greens' propaganda about this has been just so irresponsible, and you really can't come to no conclusion other than they are using misinformation in order to frankly incite conflict here in Australia, and I think that is really reprehensible. We know that we have not exported weapons to Israel. either since the conflict began or in fact for the last 5 years.
But
Now, this is I'm coming to that. Secondly, we have, as defence estimates made very clear, we have calibrated our approach to ensure that what we have in terms of arms permits is material that comes back to Australia for law enforcement or for the ADF capability. In terms of the F-35, we have F-35s. They are the largest proportion of fast jets in the Royal Australian Air Force, and we are part of 18 nations who are part of that consortia. We are involved in non-lethal parts, but of course we will always continue to consider, as defence estimates made clear, obligations under those treaties.
You'll continue to consider that. All right. Look, final one. Can you give us any update on the former Defence Chief, Mark Binskin? He's gone to find some answers from Israel over that attack in April that killed 7 aid workers, including Australian Zombie Frankham. You appointed him special advisor. You said you expected full accountability. Has that happened?
First, I again express my sympathy and condolences to Zombie Frankham's family and to the families and friends of all of those who were killed. I am meeting with Mr. Air Chief Marshal Binskin soon to talk through his work to date. Obviously, we'll also want to continue engaging with Zombie Frankham's family, and I'll have more to say when I'm able to after those processes.
Did he get any new information from Israel?
Well, I just told you what I was going to say on that, David. Obviously, we were pleased that Israel did accept our request for Mr. Binskin to have access to and to engage with relevant personnel.
And so his work's now complete?
Well, as I said to you, I'll be meeting with him soon. I'll be able to have more to say after that. Thank you.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong, thank you for joining us. Busy day in Adelaide, so appreciate your time.
Great to speak with you.
All right, there is a bit going on in Adelaide today. And in fact, in South Australia, we've seen the Premier there, Peter Malinauskas, also this week detail his plans to ban political donations. We're going to look at that and whether other jurisdictions, indeed the federal government, might follow suit. First, let's continue this conversation back to our panel. Jennifer Hewitt, Paul Sakal and Anna Henderson. Let's just talk about China there because, look, a few interesting comments. Jennifer, it is clear that while there's improvement on the trade front, there's quite a list of differences, as Penny Wong called them there, that will be addressed presumably tomorrow here in Canberra.
Yes, that's right. There are a lot of differences that remain. In fact, they're growing and rather than decreasing. It was interesting, I think, that the Premier said he was here on the 10th anniversary of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership that Tony Abbott had signed, and a mature, stable relationship would be a treasure for both countries. What, of course, that didn't say was how much the attitude both in Australia has changed towards China since then, and how much the really Chinese approaches and what they're trying to do in the region has changed as well. So I think it continues to be a very difficult relationship. Obviously, Australia wants to have the word stabilise is just used over and over and over because Australia wants to have the benefits, of trade, but it's also trying to say quietly, not as strongly I think as the Morrison government did, but say quietly, by the way, we disagree with you on this, this and this and this.
Yeah, and it's no mistake, Paul. In fact, it's quite interesting, this delegation going to PNG, as soon as the Chinese premiers left, 7 ministers, including Penny Wong, Richard Marles, the top order, are heading to PNG.
It'll be a busy plane.
Yeah.
I think her answers there on the recalling Tony Abbott and his approach to China. I think he said to Angela Merkel that our strategy on China was based on fear and greed. I think her answers on critical minerals there displayed that. We need Chinese investment, but at the same time, we're strengthening our foreign investment rules to make it more difficult for China to invest. And I think we're very cynical up here in the way we think about politics, and it's very easy to be negative about how our governments perform, but it's worth just noting the kind of triumph of Australian policy and how we stood up to China when they put the pressure on us. We're seen as an international exemplar of how a middle power can say, no, we're not going to submit to your demands. And our governments really, despite the blow-ups under Morrison, which were really around rhetoric, there's been a consistent policy. You can draw a through line. AUKUS has remained opposition government in lockstep, and we've come out of it economically sound and China's toned down its language.
And also it was in China's interest as well to use the election of a new government as a circuit breaker, because they realised that previous policy wasn't working.
Because we won.
And also just in the region it was backfiring.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're still willing to express those. I mean, Penny Wong, their concerns about Taiwan and what China's been doing. You know, she's still able to say all of that, and presumably that'll be said directly to the Premier tomorrow as well.
I mean, we've had action again around Taiwan just in the last week, like behind the panda discussion and the friendship and the words that are being used by many on the Chinese side over the course of the last week about what comes forward from this, the positives. There are really serious international issues that Australia is really being seen as an important conduit to send messages. And on that question about, Dr. Yang Han-jun and his situation, like his supporters say it is catastrophic, that he's seriously ill, that he does not have any way of getting an independent assessment of his medical condition now. So even though, there might be from the government a reticence to be as upfront about just how serious that is and talk of privacy concerns, his supporters say, in terms of the really serious issues that need to be raised behind the scenes, they're very hopeful that this is, really clearly expressed.
Yeah, I thought on that front, clearly on Taiwan as well, and on China's support for Russia too. Again, pretty strong language there from Penny Wong. But critical minerals, Jennifer, can you clear this up for us? Do we want their investment or not, or is that Jim Chalmers' problem?
I'm not surprised there's a kind of bit of confusion, because that actually reflects the kind of contradictory elements in Australia's policy, because on one hand, Chinese investment has been extremely useful in developing to the limited extent we have critical minerals processing in this country, which is why the Premier is going to visit a lithium hydroxide plant south of Perth, which is actually 51% controlled by the Chinese. But we don't want to kind of talk about that too much, because we want to have a little bit of investment, but not too much investment. We don't want control. It's a very messy area, and there's actually no kind of clear view on that yet.
Yeah, all right. Let's move on. Social media. We spoke on the program last week to David Coleman, the Shadow Communications Minister. He laid out his position on banning kids up to the age of 16 from social media. Peter Dutton certainly backed that in during the week with this.
We'd be really happy to work with the Prime Minister and the government to see the outcome here and send a very clear message that both sides of Parliament stand united against the scourge of social media and its influences on young minds.
And while I'm not sure they're necessarily going to work together on this, the Prime Minister does agree when it comes to that age limit of 16 when it comes to social media.
Well, look, I think that 16 is a reasonable age. That's what we're looking at in the work that we've done. That's what I've said before. Peter Dutton, it's good that he's caught up.
So who's caught up here, Paul? Is it actually the Prime Minister who's caught up, or the other way around?
It's the Prime Minister who's caught up. David Coleman has been talking about age verification on social media for a long, long time. There was a long period where Michelle Rowland, the Communications Minister, was relying on this really technical, years-long process around drafting industry codes instead of doing a trial on age verification. Before the budget, they relented on that and said we'd do the age verification trial. I think there's a growing realisation. It's quite interesting, actually, how seriously politicians are now taking the internet and kind of mobile phones as a political issue. I mean, Albanese talked about this being the number one point of conversation at after-school care among parents. It's almost...
And he's right.
He's right. I'm not a parent, you guys would know better than me, but it's almost more profound in a kind of daily sense than all of the issues we discuss up here. Climate change is so... it's up here, and mobile phone addiction and social media, we live and feel it. So now it's a question for the politicians of how they actually kind of capture that.
I tell you what, I wonder who's going to be first to say I'll have a minister for social media, because it spans not just kids, it goes to the misinformation, disinformation side of things. I mean, we saw a lot of this focus after the at the Bondi Junction and Wakeley stabbings and so on. So many fronts, governments, not just here but globally, are trying to keep up with where social media has gone.
I think part of the frustration for the government is that it's very simple to get up and say, we're just going to have age verification and you're going to have to show some kind of ID, and that's the solution. And I think behind the scenes of the government, they've been hearing from experts, and we this week have heard from experts as well, saying it is not that simple. People get around it. They create new online spaces. There are ways to, if you push this into darker corners where it can be less regulated. So I think there is a knowledge inside the government, and certainly with the experts that we spoke to this week, that it sounds like a quick fix, but it has potentially unintended consequences.
Well, it's a good point. We're not going to see anything happen anytime soon on this. There are still trials of this technology and finding the right way to do this. But is there also an argument that at least both sides of politics, the two leaders saying we don't think kids should be there, that helps parents in some way make their own family decision on this?
I think it helps parents realise how big an issue it is. If you're dealing with day-to-day cost of living pressures, just trying to get by, maybe two working parents, the kids, you need to keep them occupied, it's quite easy to get into a situation where you're not monitoring their usage of social media as closely. And this is at least starting that public conversation to say to people, hey, really damaging outcomes can happen here. Keep a closer eye.
And also, there are other jurisdictions like Florida, places in Europe that are moving much more quickly on this than us because it's been placed at a higher priority level. There's a bureaucratic kind of inertia in Australia on this, lots of questions about how we do it. There are actually technologies that do it and that exist now. Facebook, Meta just announced that on Facebook, if you try and change your age from below 18 to over 18 inside the app, they'll require you to use this technology called Yoti, which has been around for years, which scans your face and tests if you actually are over 18. So the technologies are there now.
What about the flip side argument, though, that for a lot of kids, they might be isolated, they might be in a remote area, or they might have personal issues that make it hard for them to socialise otherwise. This is a way for them to connect with other like-minded kids.
It clearly is a way, because there's obviously some benefits as well. But I think there is a very belated recognition of just how much damage this is doing, and it's happening everywhere, and have families, can see that, with their own children, but also the fact, for example, that schools, Australian schools, have taken so long to say banning phones is obviously a good idea. I mean, it is amazing how long that has taken when we can see the damage before us.
I'll tell you who led the debate on this, in Australia at least, was Peter Malinauskas, the South Australian Premier, was the first one out of the blocks to say he wanted a ban in South Australia. He's now also leading the charge on political donations, something he promised. This week we saw details of the legislation. He doesn't like political donations at all. There's obviously the risk that any ban gets knocked out by the High Court. He reckons the way they've written this is going to be okay. It'll be watertight and will still allow independents trying to get into the Parliament the ability to raise some funds.
We're not seeking to exclude new entrants. In fact, the legislation as we have drafted it actively encourages new entrants to participate in the process. They will retain their ability to fundraise.
There hasn't been a rush from other states to follow suit, but it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Firstly, Jennifer, political donations a big problem?
I think they are a problem. They're clearly a problem, and that's why you've had, various states, for example, banning donations from developers like in New South Wales. But I think in terms of Malinauskas, the idea that you can ban pretty well all donations is going to be a big legal problem. However, it will be popular with the public. So in that sense, he kind of doesn't lose either way.
Some politicians too you talk to, they get sick of having to go to fundraisers every other night. I'm sure they wouldn't mind it either. But look, it'll be interesting to see if this holds up in an inevitable High Court challenge. The other point too here, Paul, is does it stop third parties? We know the American system, the super PACs. Not sure how super they'd be in South Australian politics, but an independent body raising funds and spending it on campaign ads.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the technical detail of it in terms of whether it allows campaign spending if you're advocating not for a vote for a party, but for a vote in favour of an issue or against an issue.
Like Climate 200.
Exactly. So that'll be interesting. I think it's worth noting on this debate though that Peter Malinauskas is very close to Don Farrell. Don Farrell, both SDA. Aligned South Australians. They're actually very close personally as well. Don Farrell's leading the reform in Canberra.
Which isn't going that far, but it's certainly aimed at trying to clean up.
It's not going that far. And the reason it's not going that far is because, and Peter Malinauskas' people know this privately, they're opening themselves up to a High Court fight, probably with Clive Palmer, who says he's going to challenge this across the country.
Right.
And whether or not it gets knocked out, they might have to increase the donation cap so it doesn't breach the implied right to freedom of political communication. The Labor government up here has also got legal advice saying that they will open themselves up to a High Court challenge if their donation cap's too low. And because of that, the legislation will have a cap somewhere in the tens of thousands later this year, so that people can still express their political views and, within a reasonable limit.
And this would also, to be clear, stop union donations to Labor. And they're pretty important to Labor, which brings us to John Setka. And Anna, what's he done or said that has now apparently got the Fair Work Ombudsman investigating whether it's a breach of the law?
Well, I mean, John Setka is basically warning that if the outcome that he wants, which is the sacking of someone, doesn't happen, that they'll have an ability on work sites to put in place a bit of a go-slow, that there'll be an impact of this that will happen to work sites where building work is going on. It's quite extraordinary. It's a big problem for the Prime Minister because they've got an incredibly combative engagement, which is now playing out on the front pages of the newspapers.
Yeah, and he's accused of not being strong enough when it comes to John Setka. He did, of course, boot him out of the Labor Party soon after becoming leader, but this is...
But you can see that the Labor ministers are very reluctant to openly criticise John Setka too harshly, and that's a very good gift for the coalition.
He goes at the end of the year, but is it just still his influence in the CFMEU that...
yeah, the influence in his influence in the CFMEU and all his allies will remain there, and the CFMEU is increasingly powerful within the Labor Party, and that is actually, the more he draws attention to that and with that bullying tactic, the more the kind of hypocrisy of not calling that out from the government becomes obvious. So obviously Peter Dutton will want to go that as hard as he can.
I think that point about calling it out is it's really come to life. Like this has brought to life a key criticism of Albanese, is that his language is just often not emphatic enough. He could have come out on day... The reason this has gone on and been led by the Australian newspaper is because on day one, Albanese didn't come out and just immediately say in clear language, this is absolutely wrong, thuggish behaviour, it must stop, can't be allowed. He took a day to kind of get his lines right. Even still, they're a bit meek. And it does expose a kind of structural weakness of the Labor Party, that they do represent a sectional interest.
Too beholden to one union and the union leader who keeps causing them issues.
Well, he doesn't want to appear reactionary to the front pages of the paper, of which many of the letters were asterisks. But at the same time, yes, it means that it goes on and on.
Yeah. All right. Our panel, Anna Henderson, Paul Sakal and Jennifer Hewitt, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer-at-large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Hobart Mercury and the Saturday paper, the one and only John Kudelka. Very warm welcome. I got to Hobart last night and it reminded me of your tea towel with the penguins blowing sideways. Tasmania is awful, he's right. Awful place. John, we thought we'd always have Paris, but it seems it didn't add up to a hill of beans.
Well, Peter looks like he wants all the attention, so he's done a huge backflip.
Not the Olympics, of course. Mark Knight's turned it into a Olympic-type sport here. Mon Dieu, a gold medal backflip by Peter Dutton on the 2030 emissions targets. It's kind of back to the future almost, isn't it?
It's like 1945 or something.
I did love this David Rowe cartoon, the teal targets for 2025. First we take Warringah, then we take Berlin. Never did quite see Peter Dutton as Leonard Cohen, but there you go.
Yeah. Well, he is depressing.
Yeah. And David Littleproud is saying, as long as we maintain the element of surprise, and not Kooyong here. I'm not sure this is going to have quite the impact in the teal seats that they're hoping it will.
Yeah, well, there's not a lot of teal in this apart from Peter's face.
Part of Peter's face, yeah. Do you reckon a nuclear reactor would go down well here in Tasmania, John?
Maybe in the centre square of the new AFL stadium.
Megan Herbert seems to think that the coalition translating machine might have a bit of a glitch. The Climate and Sciences and IPC report people are saying climate change is real and happening now. CO2 emissions must be reduced ASAP. No new coal or gas. Nuclear is not a viable solution, as they clearly report the science in this end. And what comes out is...
Everything is fine. Abandon emissions targets. Ditch the Paris Agreement. Ramp up coal and gas. Scrap renewables. Double down on nuclear.
How good is science? The policy generating science translator 3000, powered by AI.
Abdicated intelligence.
Planning for the transition, David Pope cartoon. Unfortunately, any homework on alternative 2030 target won't be ready until after the election. That's very convenient, isn't it?
It is.
Once the dog is eaten. I'm not sure it'd be a great dog to have around the house.
Leaving things on the carpet. But
yeah.
Can I just say that the court artist was one of the greatest days out.
Maybe court art is something you could get into.
I got asked to do it once and I thought I'd know.
You'd have a speech bubble coming out.
Yeah, pretty much. There'd be editorial comment all over the place.
Kathy Wilcox found a pretty decent metaphor for Peter Dutton as a wrecking ball. I'm afraid your house will only be 42% built by 2030, not 43%. Albo the builder. Wait, I'll build you a much more expensive house that I haven't even dreamed up yet by 2050.
You'd think it was more of a floor than a ceiling, to be honest.
Yeah. Warren Brown seems to think that the common sense button on Peter Dutton might be malfunctioning. Climate, nuclear energy, Paris Agreement, social media, regulation, it's all working just fine. Yeah.
Just keep pressing
the button.
See what happens.
The Nightly came out with this cover, Out and Little Proud, which is just perfect. It's going to be a three-eyed fish election, I think.
There's not a lot of trinary vision going on, I wouldn't have thought.
Beautiful, Matt Golding. The proposed site of nuclear waste and short and medium-term Paris commitments.
Everyone gets terribly excited about the idea of nuclear because it makes them feel like, we're using proper energy here.
Lovely cartoon here. They're all standing in water, John.
Oh, mate, Dutton decided to grab the agenda for the week. So he's basically, saying, pick a card, any card. Albo's going, look, yeah, sure, we're sticking with our target, but we might just open the occasional coal mine as well. Going to give Albo a new band T-shirt every time we drum. That's the clash.
Love the fact that Albo's doing the 3 shell trick. Which shell is the lump of coal under?
And then all of a sudden the cardboard box is picked up and there's the sound of retreating footsteps.
I'm not sure the koala looks very comfortable in Tanya's hands here.
Mildly concerned koala, yeah.
John, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Mr. Spears.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kudelka. And Mike, let's get some final observations. Anna.
Thanks, Bizzy. Look, the focus has been on the Middle East a lot recently, but I had the privilege of meeting Pawiz Kawa during the week. He's from a publication, Haste Sub, 8 a.m. Media. They work out of Afghanistan. He lives in Canada. All of his journalists are working under pseudonyms in Afghanistan. They don't know who the other reporters are. Wow. They managed to pull together this online publication to tell what's happening under the Taliban, and it's pretty extraordinary.
That is extraordinary journalism. Paul.
The Teal MP, as you mentioned earlier, Kylie Tink for North Sydney, her seat was abolished. A lot of her seat now becomes Bradfield, where there was a Teal challenge to the Liberal Paul Fletcher. Been a lot of speculation that Tink is just going to move into Bradfield, but there's a shadow member for Bradfield who was the Teal candidate, Nicolette Buller. She's really keen to run, so Tink might not actually get that seat. There's a push for her to go into the Senate. And people often forget that the candidate who received the most Climate 200 money last time was David Pocock. So maybe we'll get a second kind of Tealy senator.
That'll be interesting. Jennifer.
The Reserve Bank is going to announce its interest rate decision on Tuesday. The good news is there'll be no rate rise. The bad news is there will be no rate reduction, not now and certainly not for the rest of the year, almost certainly. And so that means that the coalition is going to keep hammering this message that the government's policies, including, of course, its energy policy, are responsible for keeping up interest rates and inflation.
Another reason why they probably won't rush to an election this year. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, the Trade Minister is a South Australian. He's owned a vineyard. He's worked hard to reopen that wine trade with China. You would think most winemakers would at least know his name. Think again. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
If you're all right. Well, it's a great pleasure today to welcome Ministers Scriven, Farrell.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.